And therefore, we will continue to promote it for regional peace and global prosperity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, General Singirok. How has jostling for influence between the US and China played out in Papua New Guinea recently?
I think we've got to see the global context in that the Chinese are determined to be the champions in global trade and economy. So they have that trust, which is to support their economy by entering the Pacific, as we stated, and exploiting, for a better word, the natural resources that we have. Now, that's being handled within the context of that commercial opportunity between Papua New Guinea and China. America is the funny one because the Americans are pushing a global agenda through the use of military power. And obviously, they're supporting the corporate organizations like ExxonMobil, etc., in Papua New Guinea. So obviously, the presence of Americans are somehow supported through these corporate organizations. But the real key issue, the concerns that we all have, is the presence of the American military in Guam, which will now set a new phase of this military dimension which the Americans will play in the Pacific.
Thank you. It'll be interesting to hear Congressman Ernie Faleomavaenga's position against the motion. Congressman.
Au te mo whawhai maru atu le pa ia mal mamalu le tātou atunu o lo whakatasi mai le nei mawhitanga. Ai se I whamaru atu se tam whai atu pa wā le tūlanga le tātou whairo inga le aso. I want to take on the lead from what my colleague had stated earlier about something concerning the past. And I believe it was the poet-philosopher Santayana who said, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Whether it be for good or for evil, those are facts. It indicates in the motion about the Pacific century. I think we need to be realistic. This is the Asia-Pacific century. We have to understand that because the vast majority of the populations of the world is in the Asia-Pacific. 6 of the 10 largest armies in the world is in the Asia-Pacific region. Economic interests of every country in the world is now focusing on the Asia-Pacific region. So we cannot neglect that reality. Asia-Pacific countries have come a long way in terms of the varieties of ethnicities, nationalities. You know it, we have it. There are very few exceptions. And in those days, the words colonialism and imperialism and communism and fascism and Nazism were not bad words. It depends who was the master and who was the slave. At the height of the Cold War, there was a fundamental question as to whether the world was going to turn communist or be like a democracy like the United States of America. Well, you know what happened. The Soviet Union fell apart at the expense of the Americans paying about $5 trillion in economic and military resources so that the sense of freedom to live will be such that it's an integral part of our world community. The Warsaw Pact, we also understand that. There are 2 major things that we need to understand in terms of history. The 2 atom bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which brought in the nuclear age and the nuclear arms race that's also being realized as a reality. 1972, President Nixon made a major decision in terms Beijing became a partner and the cause of the world's geopolitical situation. 1978, Deng Xiaoping decided to change China's economy into a more free market and capitalistic system, which is very major and important in my opinion. So the point that I wanted to make here is that there's nothing wrong with being neutral depending on what the issues are. There's a more fundamental question, though, I want to say that there is no option to concern ourselves when we talk about neutrality. It talks about whether we have a decision. We know we've had conferences, the G20, the G8. Now, 2 years ago, there's a G2. And much to the disappointment of some of our allies, let's face it, People's Republic of China and the United States are the 2 major players. Those are the realities. And let's just say, despite all the things that we can become neutral in voting abstention to the United Nations, the deeper question about neutrality is that when there is a question of having a choice between communism or Marxism against democracy, I think neutrality is not an option. And I want to say also, reminders, the least effective form of government is democracy, but can you think of a better one? And then also another point I wanted to make is that the neutrality, Pacific Island nations are given a choice to choose between democracy and communism. As I said earlier, it's not a question. It begs the question why some 671,000 students from all over the world attend America's colleges and universities. Why dropouts like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates have built a foundation of greater opportunities for all people to prosper. And why a devout Muslim African-American grandfather who served as a cook in the British Army could have a grandson who later became President of the United States. I hear.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm just interested in the idea that you're raising about it. You cannot be neutral in this era, and that Pacific Island voices do need to be heard and do need to take a stance. But do you think that they are able to be heard and be considered by these G2 that you say? Is the voice that is being raised an equal voice? Is that part of the debate about neutrality?
The reality is that China now is the second most powerful economy in the world. The reality is that the United States and China, not necessarily they're confrontational. The reality is that they have to work together. There are issues that we disagree upon in a most, a very serious way. To suggest that the United States and all its our military budget for this coming year is only about $650 billion to run our Army and our Navy for 1 year. Last year it was $760 billion. Question about the South China Seas. 40% of the world's trade and economy and commerce goes through the South China Sea. And there's some serious problems with Asian countries and their relationships with China as to whether or not we're going to allow this. It's in our economic interests, and I think that's the bearing right there on neutrality. If it bears your direct economic and military interests, I don't think there's no position for neutrality in this effort.
Thank you, Congressman. I think this is a question to the panel. Those who are interested can speak up, but I'm really interested in unpacking this concept of neutrality further, because we've heard from the panelists that trade and military strength are all intertwined in this current contest for geopolitics in the region. Everything is interconnected. No Pacific Island state does not use manufactured goods from China. We're all using internet technology from the US. Can we really be neutral in this day and age, as you're saying? I mean, perhaps the side for neutrality can offer another opinion.
By being neutral, it doesn't mean that we are restricting our relationships. We will be trading with one and all. We will be negotiating with one and all. We would be going to the UN and talking to one and all. So we will be, we'll just have an open house kind of arrangement, politics, free politics, that we engage with one and all. But we are not going to be embroiled in the geopolitics that drive the conflicts between nations.
But doesn't that create a bit of a schizophrenic relationship with countries? Isn't there a danger in if you say yes to everyone, which is part of Pacific culture, that we're then creating these overlapping alliances that can create further contest or further misunderstanding?
Your relationships are either at a bilateral level or multilateral level, and they run parallel and can be quite interdependent in the way you approach things. So I don't really see any problem. We can relate to everyone with all the issues that we have.
Well, this is another interesting question, and perhaps the side against the motion might be interested in responding. But In terms of, Mr. Tavola has pointed out that there are different layers of neutrality. There's the national interest, the bilateral interest, and then you're looking at the regional work. And we see the rise of sub-regional groups like the Melanesian Spearhead Group, we have the Polynesian Union, we have the Micronesian Leaders Group. And do you think that this rise of sub-regional groups points to a more coordinated foreign policy for the region in the future? Or is foreign policy very much the domain of national governments?
But if we understand basically the foundation of the South Pacific Commission was a relic of the post-colonial period where you have major powers like France, Great Britain, and the United States continuing to control of the natives, so to speak, South Pacific Commission. And when political issues were raised, they said, no, you can't discuss it. And that's what started the whole dialogue of leaders like Mara and Henry from the Cook Islands to say, hey, we need to organize a different organization. And that's what gave birth to the Pacific Island Forum countries. But the point I wanted to make is that historically, I see nothing wrong with countries participating in different regional organizations, whatever their interests might draw them to become participants in that. I see nothing wrong with that.
Do you have a view to offer in that regard, Senator?
You know, my colleagues who speak against or speak for the issue have not denied the fact that economic assistance, economic interaction with other countries is still an important part of our governments. They have hammered on geopolitical as the thing that must be under the neutrality issue. But the neutrality issue of this debate is not just about geopolitics. It's about the whole round sphere of things in the Pacific. The FSM belongs to the Forum. That's one step for us. We have a free association agreement with the United States. We have a diplomatic relations with China. We work with Taiwan. We work with Japan. We see absolutely nothing wrong with having to interact with other countries who are willing and able to give assistance to the Pacific, not just in the form of economic assistance, but technical knowledge transfer, including safety at sea, food risks issues. And I think that without some of these organizations, if we absent ourselves, remove ourselves from these interactions with them, we would lose.
I might also add, I note that with interest about U.S. influence, whether it be for good or for evil among some of the countries, 4 or 5% of the world's population is in the United States, which consumes about 25 to 30% of the world's energy resources, which also provides more humanitarian assistance than any other countries, which also has a high percentage, about 25% of its assets are contributed to the IMF, to the World Bank, to the Asian Development Bank, all in the process of what? Giving assistance to Pacific Island nations as well as all other countries of the world. So you can say that, yeah, the United States is very strong militarily, but sometimes you have to show your military strength in order to be able to work in a positive way the needs of other countries as well. And I mentioned South China Sea as a classic example where one country seems to suggest that they own the South China Sea, and the United States is saying, I believe other Asian countries also have an interest, and we also have an interest in terms of our economic interests, as well as every Pacific Island country here.
I'm just really interested in, again, just playing off that and going back to this side, which was for the motion. It was said on this side that it's somebody else's contest. Let's focus on the Pacific. Let's not engage in a debate, in a contest that is nothing to do with this region. But does this neutrality enable the Pacific nations, the Pacific states, to determine the rules of this engagement at the geopolitical level? You talk about China being very strong, and the US, it's these big powers, but is the Pacific voice being able to say what happens in this space enough?
Yes, let me reconfirm what my colleague and I have already proposed to the panel and the audience, is that the characters of the Pacific nations are that of neutrality, that of peace, that of opening the door for friends and relatives to come. I think the issue now really is the onus is on each individual states to build such capacity through diplomatic relations to allow assistance to come in. Now, let's not forget that there's a lot of pressure on Pacific nations now. I mean, a lot of Pacific nations are young. It's still growing. We go through the process of remodeling our state economy, our government, our systems. And at the same time, Pacific nations should use forums to build capacity, sharing resources, sharing ideas, in order to be a voice, to build a greater character out of what's already inbuilt in us. I think in that way we can, through the Pacific voice, have a say as to where the superpower rivalry will go. Now, we didn't have that opportunity before Second World War. We have the opportunity now to look at these strengths and work on it. And let's not forget that every state has its own national interest and security to manage. And I think it's only realizing those weaknesses, those challenges that each state has, that will build a larger capacity so that we can deal with these challenges in front of our door.
Just to add to that, I think when we talk about geopolitics, it's a politics of trying to dominate and control. And I do believe that in the Pacific, we have no business in trying to control and dominate. We have the interest to grow and to stabilize the region. And we've been referring to Pacific regionalism, and it has come up in the discussions. We do believe that in order to have an influence in the world, to have a strong hand in our negotiations, we have to have a strong region. And the